June 1944, Normandy. The morning sky is heavy with smoke and rain. Mud clings to the boots of German infantry crouched along a hedgerow near St. Lo. In the distance, a low mechanical rumble builds, faint at first, then relentless. Through a pair of Zeiss binoculars, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss, an experienced panzer officer, scans the horizon. What he sees makes his stomach tighten. Over the rolling fields, the silhouettes of dozens of M4 Sherman tanks emerge through the mist, advancing side by side, their engines growling like a single organism. He remembers the laughter 2 years earlier in France when officers mocked the Americans' cheap, clumsy machines. They had called them death traps. But now, those same machines are pushing through fire, artillery, and wreckage, never stopping. A Tiger tank beside him opens fire, misses, and before it can reload, 3 Shermans flank it from the sides. One shell, then another. The Tiger explodes in a blinding flash. Weiss lowers his binoculars slowly. The sound of engines grows louder. The laughter, once so confident, has long died out. In the years before the Second World War, Germany was already preparing for a kind of warfare the world had never seen. While other nations were still thinking in terms of trenches and static defense, German officers under Heinz Guderian were drawing blueprints for a war of movement, Bewegungskrieg, where steel and speed would decide nations' fates. By 1939, when German panzers rolled across the Polish border, their doctrine was already refined to perfection. Columns of Panzer IIs, IIIs, and IVs advanced in coordination with dive bombers and mobile infantry. The Blitzkrieg was born, a synchronized storm that tore through outdated defenses like a blade through paper. To the watching world, it seemed as though Germany had unlocked the secret of modern war. In Washington, the U.S. Army watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. At that time, America's armored forces were little more than an experiment. The Tank Corps, disbanded after World War I, had been replaced by small mechanized units scattered across training grounds. The nation was still recovering from the Great Depression, and public sentiment leaned toward isolationism. Tanks, for most Americans, were parade machines, not instruments of destiny. When France collapsed in just 6 weeks in 1940, the shock was seismic. German panzer divisions had swept through the Ardennes, encircling entire armies with breathtaking speed. Reports from Europe told of British and French forces stunned by the pace of German armor. Even their best, the French Char B-1 and British Matilda II, had fallen to coordinated attacks and superior communication. At that moment, U.S. military planners understood the truth. America had no comparable weapon. Its armored units were equipped mostly with M2 light tanks, thin-skinned and undergunned. General Marshall and a new generation of officers, including men like Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower, began to push for modernization, but time and experience were against them. America had yet to fight. Meanwhile, in Europe, German confidence turned into arrogance. Captured Allied tanks were examined and ridiculed. German officers described American designs as clumsy and childish, little more than rolling coffins. In German briefings, American tanks were used as examples of how not to design armor. The Panzer IV, with its powerful 75mm gun and solid frontal armor, was considered the gold standard. For the Reich, technological superiority wasn't just a strategic edge, it was an ideology. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. Factories that once built automobiles and farm tractors began transforming overnight. The industrial heartbeat of Detroit shifted gears, producing not thousands of cars, but tanks, guns, and aircraft. Yet even as America mobilized, its designs were still untested. The M3 Lee, rushed into production, was awkward, a tall, ungainly hybrid with a gun mounted in the hull. German crews laughed when they first saw it in North Africa, calling it a monument to American naivety. They weren't entirely wrong. The M3 was a stopgap, a learning step. It was clumsy, but it worked, and most importantly, it could be built fast. In those early months, the U.S. Army learned its lessons the hard way. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943, American armored units faced experienced German panzer divisions under General Erwin Rommel. The result was a harsh defeat. Tanks broke down, coordination failed, and inexperienced crews panicked under fire. But something else happened, quietly, in the aftermath of that humiliation. The U.S. command didn't collapse or retreat into pride. They studied, adapted, and rebuilt. Every loss became data. Every destroyed tank became a lesson. While German officers mocked, American engineers back home were already drawing new blueprints, lighter, faster, easier to maintain, and able to be produced in staggering numbers. Germany still laughed. Their tanks were works of art, hand-built and precise. But in war, art yields to arithmetic. And soon, the arithmetic would catch up to them. The battlefield lessons of North Africa would set the stage for a transformation not just in American armor, but in American thinking itself. By 1942, America was still finding its footing in a war that had already consumed continents. Across the Atlantic, German divisions stood at the height of their power. Veterans of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. Their tank crews were battle-hardened, their confidence absolute. To them, the Americans were still apprentices, untested and naive. But that year, something began to change. From the vast steel mills of Pennsylvania to the auto plants of Detroit, an industrial miracle was taking shape. America's assembly lines, once symbols of civilian prosperity, were now instruments of war. At the center of this transformation stood a single tank, the M4 Sherman. Unlike German designs, which demanded precision craftsmanship and endless maintenance, the Sherman was built around a simple philosophy: efficiency over perfection. It could be mass-produced using existing automotive machinery. It could be repaired in the field with basic tools. It could be transported easily across oceans and repaired quickly after battle. In every sense, it was a soldier's tank. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, operated by Chrysler, was the beating heart of this revolution. Opened in 1941, it was the first facility of its kind, a factory designed purely for tank production. At its peak, it could turn out one Sherman every hour. Ford, General Motors, and other industrial giants joined in. Thousands of engineers, welders, and mechanics, many of them women, worked around the clock beneath glowing furnace light, feeding the unstoppable rhythm of America's war machine. When the first M4s reached the front lines in North Africa late in 1942, the Germans took note. The desert sun glared off their smooth, rounded turrets. They looked different, simpler, lighter. German officers smirked at their appearance. "Another American toy," one panzer commander wrote in his journal. But the laughter didn't last long. In the shifting sands of Tunisia, the Shermans showed their worth. Against Rommel's Panzer IVs, they weren't always superior, but they were reliable. They started every morning, rolled through heat and dust without faltering, and could be repaired overnight. German tanks, with their intricate engineering, often sat idle for lack of spare parts or mechanics. At Kasserine Pass, American forces suffered a bruising defeat, not because of the Sherman itself, but because of poor coordination and inexperience. Yet even in that loss, lessons were burned into memory. Commanders learned how to use armor as part of a broader system, supported by artillery, infantry, and air power. In time, that lesson would evolve into the Allied doctrine of combined arms, a formula that would overwhelm the Axis by the war's end. As 1943 unfolded, the Shermans rolled north through Sicily and Italy, adapting to new terrain, narrow roads, mountain passes, and ambush-prone valleys. German forces fought fiercely with Panthers and Tigers, tanks that could destroy a Sherman in a single shot. But they were rare, complex machines. For every Tiger that rolled off a German assembly line, America built dozens of Shermans. What the Germans saw as crude mass production, the Americans saw as strategic inevitability. Shermans didn't need to be invincible. They only needed to be everywhere. By late 1943, British and American commanders had refined their tactics. Air superiority meant German armor could rarely move by day. Supply chains kept Shermans fueled, armed, and maintained. Recovery teams pulled damaged tanks back within hours, patched them up, and sent them back into combat. Each crew knew they were part of something vast, a mechanical ecosystem powered by factories half a world away. In contrast, German industry was straining under Allied bombing and dwindling resources. Their tanks grew larger, heavier, and more complicated, technical masterpieces that Germany could no longer afford. The Tiger I, formidable in battle, required enormous fuel and frequent maintenance. It was a symbol of brilliance and of overconfidence. By the time the first Shermans landed in Britain in preparation for Operation Overlord, German officers could see the tide turning. The American tank program, once dismissed as amateur, had matured into an industrial juggernaut. Thousands of Shermans were lined up on English soil, waiting for their turn to cross the Channel. And across the front lines, a quiet realization was dawning. The Americans hadn't just built a tank. They had built a system, one that combined industrial scale, logistical precision, and battlefield adaptability in ways Germany could never match. The war of design was ending. The war of endurance was about to begin.
The M4 Sherman was not the strongest tank of World War II. It was not the fastest. It did not boast the thickest armor, nor the largest gun. Yet it was the tank that won the war. Its genius lay not in any single innovation, but in the philosophy behind its design. The technological angle, engineering for war, not perfection. When U.S. engineers designed the M4, they made deliberate compromises. They could have built a monster, something to rival the Tiger I or Panther, but instead they chose balance. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun was accurate enough, its armor thick enough, its mobility fast enough. Every feature was carefully measured not for superiority, but for sustainability. The tank's Continental R975 radial engine, originally built for aircraft, gave it remarkable reliability. It could cross 100 miles of terrain without breaking down, something few German tanks could claim. Its suspension system, simple and rugged, allowed it to maneuver across mud, snow, and sand with relative ease. The Sherman could be built quickly, repaired in the field, and modified endlessly. By 1944, there were more than a dozen variations: flamethrower versions, recovery vehicles, bridge layers, amphibious models, and the fearsome Firefly, equipped with a British 17-pounder gun, capable of destroying a Tiger from over 1,000 meters. It was a machine of flexibility. And that flexibility would prove deadlier than any single advantage in armor or firepower. The German perspective, pride and over-engineering. Across the front lines, the Germans saw things differently. To them, tanks were not just weapons, they were statements of national genius. The Tiger I was a marvel of craftsmanship. Its 88mm gun was feared across Europe. Its armor could shrug off most Allied shells, and its optics were unmatched. But beneath that beauty was a fatal flaw: complexity. Each Tiger took roughly 300,000 man-hours to build. It required meticulous machining, rare materials, and highly trained mechanics. It broke down often, consumed fuel voraciously, and was nearly impossible to recover once immobilized. In contrast, an M4 Sherman took less than half the time to produce, and if one was destroyed, another was already on its way to the front. German officers respected their machines, but misunderstood their purpose. They measured success by mechanical superiority, by building the perfect tank. But in modern war, perfection dies the moment it meets reality. A single Tiger could dominate a battlefield, but it could not dominate a war. By 1943, German panzer divisions were increasingly outnumbered. For every Tiger or Panther that rolled off the line, the Allies built dozens of Shermans. The German crews began to feel the weight of that imbalance. They could win a skirmish and still lose the campaign. Reports from the Eastern Front and North Africa described a growing frustration. Tanks sat idle for lack of spare parts or were abandoned after running dry of fuel. Their supposed technological edge had become a logistical burden. As one German officer later admitted, "We built tanks as if we were building peacetime automobiles. The Americans built tanks for war." The human angle. Life inside the Sherman. For the men who fought inside them, the Sherman was more than a machine. It was a small, moving world. Each tank was home to 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Inside, space was tight, the air thick with oil and metal dust. The steel walls clanged with every movement. When the main gun fired, the recoil shook the entire hull like thunder. Crews developed a deep bond with their machines, naming them with care. Battling Baby, Lucky Lady, Ruthless, Roughneck. They knew its strengths and weaknesses intimately. The Sherman could catch fire easily if hit in the fuel compartment. Early models were grimly nicknamed Ronsons, after the lighter that lights every time. But crews learned. They welded on extra armor, filled fuel gaps with sandbags, and used speed and coordination to outflank their enemies. Where the Tiger inspired fear through might, the Sherman inspired confidence through consistency. It started in the cold. It ran after rain. It could climb hills where heavier tanks bogged down. American and British crews learned to use that mobility to their advantage. In combat, Shermans often circled their opponents, using superior numbers to attack from multiple angles. It wasn't always glorious, but it worked. For many tankers, survival depended less on brute force than on trust. Trust in the machine, in their comrades, and in the engineers back home who kept sending parts, fuel, and replacements. The sound of its engine became a kind of comfort, a reminder of connection, that behind every Sherman was a nation in motion. By late 1943, that bond between soldier and steel had evolved into something powerful. The crews no longer saw themselves as underdogs. They were part of a larger rhythm, one that was slowly, inevitably, breaking the German war machine apart. And yet, even as the Shermans advanced, the Germans still believed their craftsmanship would prevail. They still believed precision could overcome production. But soon, the battlefield would prove otherwise. Because in war, numbers have a voice. And by 1944, that voice was roaring louder than ever.
The logistical angle, the arsenal of democracy. Behind every Sherman that rolled onto the battlefield stood a vast, invisible network, a nation of factories, railways, ports, and workers. Franklin D. Roosevelt had called it the arsenal of democracy, and by 1943, that arsenal was in full motion. While Germany's tank industry relied on a handful of specialized facilities, the United States had mobilized an entire economy. From the steel works of Pittsburgh to the assembly lines of Detroit, every link in the chain was synchronized with breathtaking precision. The result was scale, unprecedented in human history. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. produced over 49,000 Shermans, alongside tens of thousands of spare engines, tracks, and gun barrels. Shipyards in New York, Baltimore, and San Francisco turned out transport vessels packed with armor, fuel, and ammunition.
Trains rumbled across the Midwest, carrying tank parts to coastal depots, where they were loaded onto Liberty ships, bound for Britain, North Africa, and later, France. German intelligence reports began to note the sheer rhythm of this production. Even after heavy losses, new tanks kept appearing, as if from nowhere. In contrast, Germany's industrial output was collapsing under Allied bombing campaigns. Fuel shortages crippled the panzers. Critical factories like Henschel and MAN were operating at a fraction of capacity. For every Tiger that Germany painstakingly assembled, America rolled out 10 Shermans, with spare parts to match. It wasn't just a contest of steel. It was a contest of systems. And the German system was breaking. Logistics became America's most potent weapon. The ability to repair, refuel, and replace tanks faster than the enemy could destroy them turned every battlefield loss into a temporary inconvenience. A destroyed Sherman was replaced within days. A destroyed Tiger was irreplaceable. This was the real secret of the Sherman, not its gun or its armor, but its availability. It was the tank that never stopped coming. The tactical angle. Adaptation on the battlefield. By 1944, Allied commanders had transformed how the Sherman was used in combat. Early in the war, American crews tried to match German tanks one-on-one and paid dearly for it. But through experience, they learned that victory came through coordination, not duel. At the tactical level, Shermans were rarely alone. They operated in platoons of 5, supported by infantry and air cover. Forward observers called in artillery or P-47 Thunderbolts to strike German positions before the tanks advanced. The result was a synchronized dance of movement and firepower. In open terrain, Shermans exploited mobility. They outflanked heavier German armor, striking from the sides or rear. In cities, they worked with engineers to clear obstacles and infantry to suppress anti-tank teams. And when terrain or visibility turned against them, they relied on speed, advancing fast, overwhelming the enemy's ability to react. The British Army, fighting alongside American forces, added another layer to this strategy. They fielded the Sherman Firefly, whose powerful 17-pounder gun could penetrate even the Tiger's thick front armor. Fireflies were mixed into regular Sherman units, their longer barrels camouflaged to appear identical until the moment they fired. German crews soon learned to fear them. By mid-1944, the Allies were no longer reacting to German tactics. They were dictating the tempo. The Sherman's versatility made it the backbone of a war machine that could fight anywhere, desert, forest, snow, or city. For Germany, each battle became a war of attrition they could no longer sustain. Their precision weapons were falling victim to an enemy that fought with speed, coordination, and relentless supply. The psychological angle. The collapse of German confidence. War is as much mental as mechanical. And by 1944, the psychological tide had turned. German officers who once laughed at American toy tanks began writing increasingly desperate reports. They spoke of endless columns of Shermans, of how, no matter how many they destroyed, more kept coming. It wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. The illusion of superiority that had carried German panzer divisions through Poland, France, and the early years of the war was beginning to fracture. Their aces, men who once claimed dozens of kills, were now facing enemies who refused to disappear. For every Sherman knocked out, 3 more filled the gap. For every German victory, the front still moved backward. Captured German crewmen confessed astonishment at the American supply system. One noted bitterly, "When one tank burns, they bring another. When one road is bombed, they build 2. Even Rommel, once the master of maneuver warfare, recognized the change. He remarked that fighting the Americans was like battling an entire factory floor armed with tanks. On the Allied side, morale grew stronger with every campaign. The soldiers understood the pattern. If a battle was lost, the next one would be fought with more men, more tanks, and more fuel. Confidence replaced caution. The Sherman, once ridiculed, had become a symbol of unstoppable momentum. For the German crews, each sight of those rounded turrets and white stars was a grim reminder that the balance of the war had shifted. Each engagement, no matter how fierce, ended the same way, with the Shermans moving forward and the Germans falling back. By the time the Allies crossed into France in June of 1944, the laughter of 1942 was a distant echo. The pride of German engineering now sat rusting on the fields of Normandy, surrounded by the dull green armor of the tanks they had once mocked. And as the rumble of 1,000 engines filled Europe, it became clear that this was no longer a battle of machines. It was a battle of endurance, one that Germany could not win. By mid-1944, the battlefield of Europe had transformed into an industrial crucible, a war of production, fuel, and momentum. The Germans still possessed formidable tanks, the Tiger, the Panther, and even the King Tiger, but these mechanical titans were scattered, often immobilized by fuel shortages or maintenance breakdowns. The Americans, on the other hand, had unleashed a flood of M4 Shermans across Normandy. By June's end, more than 2,300 Shermans had landed in France. They rolled out of the landing craft, clattering over steel causeways, engines roaring. Where a Tiger was a precision blade, the Sherman was a hammer. Not elegant, but unstoppable. At first, German commanders remained confident. Their intelligence briefings still claimed that the M4 was inferior, undergunned, underarmored, a mass-produced mistake. But those reports failed to grasp the new kind of warfare the Allies were now waging, one built on coordination, speed, and sheer presence. In the hedgerows of Normandy, battles erupted at point-blank range. German Panthers hid behind thick foliage, waiting for the Shermans to appear. A single well-placed 75mm shell could turn an M4 into a fireball. But what the Germans hadn't anticipated was how quickly another Sherman would replace the one destroyed. Within hours, fresh tanks arrived from the beachhead, guided by radio and aerial reconnaissance. The U.S. Army's logistical chain, a masterpiece of planning, was the real superweapon. Fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, everything flowed like clockwork from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. Each Sherman crew knew their tank wasn't indestructible. They knew a direct hit from a Tiger could tear through them. But they also knew they outnumbered their opponents, sometimes 10 to 1. And that, in war, changes everything. One of the most defining moments came during Operation Cobra in late July 1944. After weeks of being bogged down in the bocage, the U.S. Army unleashed a storm, 3,000 bombers blanketing the German front near Saint-Lô. When the dust settled, hundreds of Shermans surged forward through the shattered defenses. German units, including elite Panzer Lehr divisions, were shattered. The speed of the advance shocked even the Allies themselves. In 72 hours, the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions broke through the German line, capturing thousands of prisoners and cutting off retreating units. Where once the Germans dictated tempo, now the Sherman-led spearheads set the rhythm. The M4 wasn't faster on paper, but its reliability made it unstoppable. It didn't need to stop for repairs or cooling. Its engines kept running. Its supply trucks kept coming. Its commanders kept pushing forward. Meanwhile, German officers began to confront a brutal reality. Even their best tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, couldn't hold the line indefinitely. Each destroyed Tiger represented not just a tactical loss, but a logistical disaster. Each one took weeks to replace. By contrast, U.S. factories back home were rolling out 2,000 Shermans per month. The ratio was now impossible to ignore. In the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, retreating German columns found themselves under relentless attack from Sherman formations supported by Thunderbolt fighter bombers. The battlefield was chaos, burning wrecks, crushed roads, shattered convoys. German tank crews abandoned their vehicles, out of fuel, out of hope. And for the first time, even the most hardened Wehrmacht officers admitted that America's tanks were no longer a joke. The shift wasn't just material, it was psychological. The laughter of 1942 had turned into disbelief. The inferior tank had become the symbol of Allied domination. By the time Allied troops crossed the Seine and raced toward Paris, the Sherman was everywhere, in the fields, on the roads, across bridges. Its rhythmic clatter had become the soundtrack of Germany's crumbling Western Front. And still, the momentum grew. As one German officer later wrote, "We had underestimated not the tank, but the system behind it." The system, logistics, air power, and industrial scale, had now converged into a single force. The M4 Sherman was no longer just a machine. It was the visible face of an empire of production. And it was about to face its ultimate test: the drive into the heart of Europe, where Hitler's elite armored divisions would make their final stand.
Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Snow drifts cover the narrow roads of Belgium. The air is so cold that steel cracks under pressure. From the white haze of dawn, German tanks roll forward once more. Tiger IIs, Panthers, and assault guns, in what would become Hitler's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious: to split the Allied line, capture Antwerp, and force a political collapse of the Western Front. The German armored spearheads, commanded by veterans like Joachim Peiper, crashed into thinly held American lines. The initial shock was devastating. U.S. infantry and light tank units were scattered. Whole villages fell within hours. Among the frozen roads, the M4 Shermans again faced their old nemesis, but this time, they were not the same tanks that had landed in Normandy. By late 1944, the Sherman had evolved. The newer M4A3E8 Easy 8 models had thicker armor, better suspensions, and the powerful 76mm gun capable of piercing the side armor of a Panther at range. The crews were better trained, the commanders more experienced, and the support network now extended seamlessly across Europe. But the Ardennes was chaos. Visibility was low, roads were clogged, and temperatures plunged below freezing. Engines froze overnight, and oil turned to sludge. Yet even in this nightmare landscape, the Shermans held their ground. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the 10th Armored Division and elements of the 101st Airborne used their Shermans to hold key crossroads. Every tank became a fortress, every shell a lifeline. German tanks had the advantage in power, but not in endurance. The King Tiger, with its 88mm gun, was terrifying, but sluggish. It consumed fuel at a crippling rate. Many were abandoned when fuel convoys never arrived. The Americans, by contrast, had fuel and mobility. Within days, General George S. Patton's Third Army executed one of the most dramatic maneuvers of the war, a 90-degree pivot north through snow and mud to relieve Bastogne. Leading his spearhead were columns of M4 Shermans, their engines howling through blizzards. When Patton's tanks smashed through to Bastogne on December 26th, the defenders had been surrounded for a week. The relief column entered the town to cheers and tears. In the snow-choked streets lay the wrecks of Panthers and Shermans alike, evidence of the war's brutality. But the tide had turned again. The German offensive was spent. What was meant to be a decisive counterblow became a death struggle for the last of the Reich's fuel and armor. In the following weeks, as the snow melted, Allied forces advanced relentlessly. Sherman columns rolled east through the devastated Ardennes, crossing the Rhine at Remagen in March 1945.
a crossing that stunned the German command. On the other side of the river, the Shermans faced the remnants of Hitler's panzer divisions, fragments of once mighty armies now held together by desperation. In battles around the Ruhr and into central Germany, the M4's speed, coordination, and numbers crushed resistance faster than the enemy could regroup. The German generals who once scoffed at American designs now watched powerless as wave after wave of Shermans pushed through towns, forests, and valleys. Even the mighty Tiger II, the heaviest tank ever fielded by Germany, proved too late to change the outcome. Weighing nearly 70 tons, it broke bridges, ran out of fuel within hours, and often had to be destroyed by its own crew to avoid capture. In contrast, the Shermans moved forward, refueled, rearmed, repaired, like clockwork. It was not one tank defeating another. It was a system defeating a legend. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin from the west and the Soviets from the east, Germany's once proud armored corps was gone. In every captured town, American units found rows of abandoned panzers, engines cold, tracks torn off. The officers who had once laughed at the cheap American tank were now either dead, prisoners, or silent. On April 30th, Hitler was dead. A week later, Germany surrendered. Across Europe, the Sherman stood parked amid the ruins, a symbol of a new kind of warfare, not perfection, but persistence. In the months that followed, Allied soldiers reflected on what had carried them to victory. It wasn't just courage or tactics, it was the power of a nation that could produce, ship, and maintain thousands of tanks thousands of miles away from home and keep them fighting every single day. The laughter that had greeted the M4 in 1942 was now a historical echo, a ghost from another world. And as Germany burned and Europe was liberated, one fact was undeniable. The tank that was never meant to be feared had become the machine that broke the backbone of the Wehrmacht. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but for those who survived the inferno, the tankers, the engineers, the commanders, the question remained, what had this machine truly represented? Was it just the product of industrial might, or a reflection of a nation's will to adapt, endure, and overcome? That question lingered as the guns fell silent, leading us into the aftermath.
When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the numbers told a story as brutal as any battlefield. Over 49,000 M4 Shermans had been built by the end of the war. More than 19,000 served in Europe alone. By contrast, Germany had produced just 1,347 Tiger Is, 492 Tiger IIs, and roughly 6,000 Panthers. The arithmetic of destruction was undeniable. For every German tank destroyed, multiple Shermans had often been lost, but there were always more to take their place. The United States had fought not as an army of elite machines, but as an engineered system of replacement and resilience. Across the ruined landscape of France, Belgium, and Germany, burnt-out shells of Shermans lay beside the wrecks of panzers. The difference was that the Allies could afford those losses. The Germans could not. In the aftermath, Allied officers began to study what had happened, not just in the fighting, but in the philosophy of war itself. The Germans had built tanks for dominance. The Americans had built tanks for endurance. In 1943, German factories struggled under constant Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and over-engineering. The Panther and Tiger were masterpieces of design, but nightmares of production. Each required hundreds of man-hours, specialized tools, and rare alloys. Even minor damage could sideline them for weeks. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed to be assembled, repaired, and replaced anywhere. A factory worker in Detroit could build one. A mechanic in Normandy could fix one. A spare engine could be swapped out in hours. This philosophy extended beyond tanks.
It defined the American way of war, one that prioritized reliability, coordination, and adaptability over perfection. Across the ruined landscape of France, Belgium, and Germany, burnt-out shells of Shermans lay beside the wrecks of Panzers. The difference was that the Allies could afford those losses. The Germans could not. In the aftermath, Allied officers began to study what had happened, not just in the fighting, but in the philosophy of war itself. The Germans had built tanks for dominance. The Americans had built tanks for endurance. In 1943, German factories struggled under constant Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and over-engineering. The Panther and Tiger were masterpieces of design, but nightmares of production. Each required hundreds of man-hours, specialized tools, and rare alloys. Even minor damage could sideline them for weeks. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed to be assembled, repaired, and replaced anywhere. A factory worker in Detroit could build one. A mechanic in Normandy could fix one. A spare engine could be swapped out in hours. This philosophy extended beyond tanks. It defined the American way of war, one that prioritized reliability, coordination, and adaptability over perfection. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the defeated German ranks. Captured officers described their shock at the speed of Allied recovery after every engagement. One recalled, "We destroyed a column of Shermans on Monday, and by Wednesday they were back again. It was like fighting the ocean." Even German engineers in post-war interrogations admitted that their approach had failed strategically. The Tiger might have been a marvel of craftsmanship, but it was a luxury weapon in an industrial war. The Sherman's design choices, often mocked, now seemed prophetic. Its medium armor and moderate gun made it light enough to transport, repair, and mass-produce. Its gasoline engine, though risky, allowed faster mobility, and its versatility made it adaptable for every role: tank destroyer, flamethrower, amphibious support, recovery vehicle, even mobile artillery. Where the Tiger was an apex predator, the Sherman was an ecosystem. For the men who fought in them, the tank's legacy was personal. American crews called their Shermans Ronsons, after the lighter brand, because they lit up every time. The name carried bitterness and humor in equal measure. Survival often depended on teamwork and speed. Crews learned to flank, coordinate with artillery, and rely on combined arms. Yet even with its flaws, veterans respected their machine. Many later said they would not have traded their Sherman for a Panther because their tank always started, always moved, and always had support behind it. That reliability became its greatest weapon. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Sherman's success was studied as a triumph of logistics and industrial planning. By 1945, U.S. factories were producing one new tank every 30 minutes. Tank parts were standardized across assembly lines, something no other nation achieved. This meant any broken Sherman anywhere in Europe could be cannibalized for parts. The supply chain reached across oceans, through convoys, into ports, across railways, and finally to the front lines. Every link held. And that, more than any single technological edge, is what crushed the Wehrmacht's armored might. As the Allies occupied Germany, their tank depots were filled with surviving Shermans, some barely scratched, others patched with field repairs and bullet scars. They were lined up, cleaned, and repainted for the next mission, the Pacific. But for most, Europe had been their greatest test and their greatest victory. Still, the lessons of the Sherman's War were not lost. It had proved that quantity has a quality of its own, that reliability could defeat sophistication, and that wars are won not only by what's on the battlefield, but by what stands behind it. And behind every Sherman stood an entire nation. The world had changed. The war was over. but in the halls of the Pentagon, in the ruins of Berlin, and in every factory that had built a tank, the question was already being asked. What comes next for the machine that won the Industrial War?
In the months after Germany's surrender, Europe was a continent of ghosts, shattered towns, silent fields, and endless graveyards of metal. Among the wreckage, the M4 Sherman stood apart, not as a monument of perfection, but as proof of endurance. It had carried an army across continents, survived countless ambushes, and symbolized a truth that the world would not forget. Wars are not won by the best weapon, but by the weapon that fights every day. In occupied Germany, Allied engineers and strategists began analyzing every aspect of the armored war. They compared wrecks, studied gun impacts, and measured armor angles. On paper, the German tanks seemed superior. Thicker armor, longer guns, deadlier range. But charts and blueprints could not capture the true battlefield calculus. For every Tiger that broke through a line, a dozen Shermans countered it with artillery, airstrikes, and relentless maneuvering. For every German advance, American logistics ensured another wall of steel stood ready the next day. What became clear was that the M4 had redefined modern warfare. It proved that industrial efficiency, coordination, and mobility could defeat even the most advanced designs. This revelation echoed far beyond 1945. It became the foundation of NATO's doctrine and the U.S. Army's future philosophy. After the war, thousands of Shermans were shipped worldwide. They became the backbone of newly formed armies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. France rebuilt its armored divisions with Shermans. Britain upgraded them with the 17-pounder gun, creating the Firefly, one of the few tanks capable of killing a Tiger at range. Israel would later transform surplus Shermans into the M50 and M51 Super Shermans, fighting effectively even into the Six-Day War of 1967, more than 20 decades after World War II ended. Each version carried the same DNA, a reliable chassis, a dependable engine, and design simplicity that allowed endless modification. The German tanks, meanwhile, vanished into history. Their complexity made them relics, too expensive, too fragile, too slow to evolve. In a poetic reversal, the tank that Germany mocked as inferior became the most enduring armored vehicle of the 20th century. In the United States, the Sherman's legacy shaped the birth of a new generation of armor, the M26 Pershing, the Patton series, and eventually the M60 and Abrams. All carried lessons written in the mud of Normandy and the snow of the Ardennes. Never build a weapon too perfect to produce in numbers. Never underestimate logistics. And never forget that technology must serve strategy, not the other way around. The Sherman had forced this evolution. It had turned the American tank arm from an experimental branch into the cornerstone of modern mechanized warfare. But its legacy wasn't only mechanical. It was human. For every tank that rolled off an assembly line, there were workers, men and women, who believed that what they were building mattered. For every Sherman that crossed France, there were crews who lived inside it, 5 souls bound by steel and survival. Many never made it home. Those who did often spoke of the strange bond between man and machine, how the tank that was once feared for its fragility became their armor, their world, their brotherhood. Veterans recalled nights spent inside the hull as artillery shook the earth outside. They remembered the smell of hot oil, the clang of shells, the way the engine's hum became a kind of heartbeat. The Sherman, for all its imperfections, had carried them through hell and home again. In Germany, historians would later admit that their officers had underestimated not just American tanks, but the spirit behind them, a collective will that fused industrial might with human determination. The laughter of 1942 had been replaced by respect, even awe. By 1945, no one in the Wehrmacht was laughing.
They had witnessed a machine that represented not weakness, but America itself, adaptable, unrelenting, and always in motion. As the world moved into the Cold War, the lessons of the Sherman became doctrine. Every major power began designing tanks that balanced firepower with mass production, protection with mobility. The age of the super-heavy behemoth had ended. The age of the reliable, adaptable fighting machine had begun. And though newer tanks would replace it, the M4 never truly disappeared. It continued to serve in Korea, in the Middle East, in training fields across the world, a rolling testament to a simple truth forged in war. Perfection fails. Persistence wins. The echoes of those engines, once heard across Normandy and the Ardennes, now belong to history. But every tank that rumbles across a battlefield today carries, in some small way, the spirit of the Sherman, the tank that was mocked, then feared, and finally remembered as the machine that crushed the myth of German invincibility. In every war, there is a weapon that becomes more than a tool. It becomes a mirror of the nation that built it. For Nazi Germany, it was the Tiger. Massive, complex, lethal, but unsustainable. For the United States, it was the Sherman. Modest, reliable, built in numbers that defied imagination. Where the Tiger symbolized perfection pursued to the point of ruin, the Sherman represented the quiet strength of practicality. It wasn't beautiful, but it endured. It wasn't invincible, but it was always there. And in the end, that endurance, not raw power, won the war. The laughter of German officers in 1942 had come from a place of arrogance, a belief that craftsmanship could outmatch scale, that design genius could overcome industry. But by 1945, the ruins of Europe told another story. The story of a nation that learned faster, produced faster, and fought longer. The Sherman had not just crushed German defenses, it had crushed the myth of technological superiority itself. Every field of wrecked panzers was proof that no machine, however advanced, can survive when the system behind it collapses. And every Sherman that reached Berlin was proof that a weapon built for endurance can outlast brilliance built for pride. Today, the few Shermans that remain sit silent in museums and memorials. Their olive paint is faded, their guns cold, their engines still. Yet when you stand beside one and touch the rough steel of its armor, it feels alive. Because it carries the memory of the men who drove it, the factories that built it, and the idea that victory belongs not to perfection, but to perseverance. In that sense, the Sherman was never just a tank. It was the embodiment of a truth that still echoes through history. Strength is not in what cannot be broken, but in what never stops moving forward.